Between 1861 and 1865, the United States turned its guns on itself. Over 620,000 Americans died in the violence, a staggering 2% of the entire population at the time. To understand why a young nation would willingly tear itself apart, we have to look at how it made its money. This chart shows the stark economic divide driving the country in the 19th century. The North aggressively embraced the Industrial Revolution, building factories and mass transit, while the Southern economy remained almost entirely stagnant, relying heavily on traditional agriculture. In the South, wealth was extracted directly from the soil. Cash crops like cotton and tobacco were highly profitable, but that profit relied entirely on the brutal exploitation of enslaved African labor, a system deeply rooted in the colonies since 1619. Two entirely incompatible economic engines, one industrial, one agricultural, now shared a single expanding border. Their physical collision had become inevitable. As the United States expanded westward, that collision became violent. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed new territories to decide if they would permit slavery. The result was a wave of localized bloodshed known as Bleeding Kansas, as pro- and anti-slavery factions fought for control of the new land. By November 1860, the political landscape fractured. The newly formed Republican Party elected Abraham Lincoln to the presidency on a platform explicitly promising to halt the Western expansion of slavery. For Southern leaders, Lincoln's victory was a direct, fatal threat. Without the ability to expand their slave-dependent agriculture into new territories, they believed their entire economic model would rapidly collapse. Unwilling to accept federal authority over their property, the Southern states broke away from the Union, officially declaring themselves the independent Confederate States of America. By launching a preemptive strike to protect their agricultural wealth, the Southern leadership turned a decades-long political debate into an armed crisis, physically ripping the country in two. The violence became official in April 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. For the first 2 years, the Confederacy held a distinct advantage, with General Robert E. Lee consistently outmaneuvering Union forces at early engagements like the First Battle of Bull Run. That Southern momentum stalled in September 1862 at the Battle of Antietam. Despite nearly 23,000 combined casualties in a single day, the Union Army held the field, securing a crucial tactical victory. Lincoln seized on that victory to issue this document, the Emancipation Proclamation. By legally declaring that all enslaved people within rebellious states were free, Lincoln altered the objective of the conflict. He tied the preservation of the Union directly to the destruction of slavery. This maneuver trapped the Confederacy globally. Great Britain relied heavily on Southern cotton for its textile mills, but because the British had already abolished slavery, they could no longer intervene to support a war explicitly fought to maintain it. On the ground, the military impact was immediate. Over 86,000 freed slaves abandoned Southern plantations and enlisted in the Union Army, solving a critical manpower shortage for the North. By offering freedom in exchange for service, Lincoln weaponized the South's most valuable economic asset, starving Confederate supply lines while directly reinforcing the Union war machine. By 1864, the Confederate military was severely depleted. 3 years into the conflict, their factory output had stalled, their supply lines were severed, and their battlefield casualties were irreplaceable. Facing imminent collapse, Confederate Major General Patrick Cleburne drafted a controversial solution. He proposed that the South should arm its most capable enslaved men, train them to fight the Union, and grant them freedom in return. When Cleburne presented this to his superiors, the backlash was absolute. Confederate leadership buried the proposal, demanding that the topic never be discussed among the generals again. They were caught in an ideological trap of their own making. If the Confederacy armed and freed their slaves to secure independence, they would be dismantling the exact institution they had seceded to protect. Unwilling to compromise their social hierarchy, Southern leadership chose to endure severe troop shortages. They explicitly decided they would rather lose their new nation than abandon their system of slavery. The Union took full advantage of that weakness. Under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant, the North leveraged its superior industrial might, relentlessly pushing vast numbers of well-supplied troops deep into Confederate territory. Grant's forces systematically choked off the South, eventually capturing the vital rail center in Petersburg, Virginia. Without that key supply line, the Confederate capital of Richmond was completely isolated. Outnumbered, surrounded, and starving, Robert E. Lee formally surrendered the Confederate Army near the Appomattox River in April 1865. But the surrender did not bring immediate peace. Just days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by Confederate loyalist John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln's murder was a brutal reminder that while the armies had laid down their weapons, the deep ideological fractures that caused the war were nowhere close to healing. To ensure the conflict could never be repeated, the federal government rewrote the law of the land. The passage of the 13th Amendment completely abolished slavery across the entirety of the reunited nation. This was followed by the 14th and 15th Amendments, which redefined the United States as an indivisible entity. The country shifted from a loose collection of states into a single nation bound by a central authority that codified national citizenship and voting rights. Forced to abandon slave labor, the Southern economy began a slow transition toward industrialization. Government grants and subsidies encouraged the growth of new businesses, gradually pulling the South toward the industrial model used by the North. This centralized constitutional framework became a blueprint for other nations. Years later, as international democracies like India drafted their own founding documents, they looked to this redefined American Union as a model for creating an indivisible federal republic. By surviving its own destruction, the United States burned away its original sin, replacing an outdated agricultural model with the industrial and legal foundation of a modern global superpower.